RomCalms, where romance and relaxation meet. Subscribe for a new romance novella every week. Whispers of the Chateau, presented by RomCalms. Chapter 1. Elizabeth stood enveloped in the grey embrace of London's fog, her figure a solitary silhouette against the frenzied backdrop of King's Cross Station. Steam billowed from idling trains, merging with the morning mist to form a spectral shroud that seemed to both isolate and expose her. The station was alive with the sounds of imminent departures. The shrill cries of porters, the staccato rhythm of hurried footsteps, and the occasional whistle that cut sharply through the air. Dressed impeccably in her navy traveling suit, her attire was an outward testament to her genteel upbringing, yet it belied the tumultuous rebellion simmering within her. Elizabeth's eyes, a striking contrast to the muted hues of her surroundings, were alight with a mixture of determination and apprehension. They reflected the burning desire for freedom, a longing to escape the gilded cage of Victorian society and its myriad of expectations. Clara, her faithful maid, hovered nearby, her expression etched with concern. "Miss Elizabeth, is this truly your wish?" she asked, her voice a tremulous note amidst the cacophony of the station. "To forsake all you know for an uncertain future?" Turning to Clara, Elizabeth's face softened, yet her gaze remained unwavering. "Yes, Clara," she replied, her voice imbued with a quiet strength. "For too long, I've felt like a bird caged by invisible wire. I must seek the freedom to chart my own course, to discover who I might be when unbound from these stifling constraints my family has set upon me." The call to board echoed through the station, a herald of the impending departure. Elizabeth handed her ticket to the conductor, her hand momentarily lingering on the small piece of paper which had written on it the beginning of her new journey. Settling into her compartment, the leather seats embracing her in their worn comfort, Elizabeth took out a small leather-bound journal, a companion for her thoughts and reflections. She began to write, the ink flowing onto the blank pages. As the train steamed ahead, Elizabeth embraced the uncertainty and excitement of her new path, for in leaving behind the familiar, she was journeying toward a truer self. The rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks became the soundtrack to Elizabeth's thoughts as she journeyed through the English countryside. The landscape outside her window transitioned from the dense, smog-filled streets of London to the verdant, rolling hills of the countryside, a picturesque scroll of greens and golds that blurred with the train's steadfast pace. Inside, the compartment was a cocoon of quiet introspection, the soft murmur of other passengers a distant echo to her own swirling thoughts. The Channel crossing was a brief interlude, a momentary pause in her journey. Standing on the deck of the boat, Elizabeth watched as the white cliffs of Dover receded into the distance, along with her old life. The wind tugged at her hair and cloak, whispering of new beginnings and uncharted territories as France slowly came into view. Upon arrival at the quaint French station, the air held a sweetness tinged with the scent of wildflowers and earth, a striking contrast to the smoky tang of London. The quaintness of the countryside station, with its bustling activity and rustic charm, welcomed her into a world that seemed imbued with a slower, more deliberate pace of life. The carriage ride to her Aunt Marguerite's cottage guided Elizabeth through a landscape that seemed to leap from the pages of the storybooks she had read as a child. Fields of wheat and vineyards rolled past, punctuated by the occasional farmhouse or sleepy village. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow that seemed to ignite the world in a blaze of color and light. As the cottage came into view, nestled among a copse of trees and flowering shrubs, a wave of relief washed over Elizabeth. It was quaint and inviting, with smoke curling from the chimney and the faint sound of laughter spilling from inside. Aunt Marguerite was waiting at the door, her face alight with joy and anticipation. The night brought a coolness that whispered through the open window, carrying with it the promise of new adventures and the freedom to discover her true self. And as she drifted off to sleep, the gentle chorus of the countryside lulling her into dreams, Elizabeth knew that her story was just beginning. Chapter 2. The first rays of dawn painted the quaint French countryside in strokes of pink and gold, gently coaxing Elizabeth from the embrace of sleep. She awoke in the cozy room under the eaves of Aunt Marguerite's cottage, the air outside filled with the sweet chorus of morning birds and the distant tolling of a village bell. Dressing in attire that was both practical and befitting of her status as a well-bred Englishwoman, Elizabeth joined her aunt at the breakfast table. The spread was a delightful array of local produce, fresh bread, cheese, and fruits, each bite a revelation of flavors far more vivid than the fare back home. Over breakfast, Aunt Marguerite spoke animatedly of the village and its inhabitants, her stories painting a picture of a close-knit community steeped in tradition and camaraderie. Together they set out under the warming sun, making their way along a well-trodden path bordered by fields and vineyards. The village, as it came into view, was a picturesque assembly of stone houses, its central square a hub of activity. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh bread from the local bakery. Children darted between stalls and shop fronts, while elders sat contentedly in the shade, their conversations a melodic hum that added to the village's charm. As they walked towards the village center, Aunt Marguerite pointed out landmarks and introduced Elizabeth to the routines and characters that made up the village. "You see, Elizabeth, over there is Monsieur Dubois' market. He has the freshest produce in the area. Be sure to greet him. He's a pillar of our little community," she explained, her voice warm with affection. "Bonjour, Monsieur Dubois," Elizabeth called out, practicing her French with a tentative smile. "Ah, bonjour, Mademoiselle Elizabeth. Welcome." Monsieur Dubois replied, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I've heard much about you from Marguerite. Please, try some of our ripest cherries." The market was alive with the morning hustle, vendors calling out their wares, and locals mingling in the narrow aisles. Elizabeth felt a sense of wonder at the vibrant community life, so refreshingly different from the rigid social circles of England. As they continued through the village, children darted past them, their laughter echoing through the streets. An elderly woman, Madame Girard, sat knitting outside her home, her fingers deftly moving through the yarn. "Bonjour, Madame Girard," Aunt Marguerite greeted. "Bonjour, Marguerite, and who is this lovely young lady with you?" Madame Girard inquired, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "This is my niece, Elizabeth, from England. She's come to stay with me for a while," Aunt Marguerite replied, her hand resting gently on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Ah, welcome, mademoiselle. You'll find our little village quite charming. And if you ever wish to learn some knitting, you come right to me," Madame Girard offered with a warm smile. "Thank you, madam. I might just take you up on that offer," Elizabeth responded, feeling more at ease with each interaction. The morning passed with more introductions and exchanges, the villagers' warmth and openness touching Elizabeth deeply. She felt a growing sense of belonging, her initial nervousness melting away in the face of genuine community spirit. As they made their way back to the cottage, Elizabeth turned to Aunt Marguerite, a smile spreading across her face. "Thank you for showing me around, Aunt. Everyone's been so welcoming. It's like stepping into a whole new world, one that I'm beginning to love already." Aunt Marguerite squeezed her hand, her eyes reflecting the joy of shared discovery. "I knew you'd fit right in, my dear. This is just the beginning." The afternoon air was warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers as Elizabeth and Aunt Marguerite continued their exploration beyond the village boundaries. The path they took wound gently through the countryside, each turn revealing vistas of sprawling vineyards and fields dotted with the vibrant colors of wildflowers. The rhythm of rural life pulsed around them, a harmony of nature and nurture that had continued for generations. As they walked, a chateau began to emerge in the distance. Standing proudly atop a gentle rise, it commanded the landscape, its walls and towers bearing the marks of time. Elizabeth felt an inexplicable pull towards the grand structure, its presence igniting a curiosity that mingled with the tales Aunt Marguerite shared of its past glory and gradual decline. The closer they got, the more the chateau seemed to dominate the horizon, its once pristine facade now weathered and worn, yet no less impressive. It was as if the building itself was a stoic guardian of history, holding within its walls stories of joy, sorrow, and the passage of time. The surrounding gardens, visible even from a distance, appeared wild and untamed, a stark contrast to the meticulous grooming of English estates. Reaching the outer edge of the chateau's grounds, Elizabeth was struck by the sheer scale of the estate. The gardens, though overgrown, were a labyrinth of hidden paths, ancient trees, and bursts of color from flowers that refused to be tamed. The air was thick with the scent of earth and bloom, a fragrant reminder of the cycle of life that continued unabated within this microcosm. "Would you like to take a look?" Aunt Marguerite asked. "Are we allowed to? Will the owners not be upset with us?" "Nobody lives here now. It's open for the community to visit and appreciate. There are caretakers to maintain the property as best they can, but that's all. Come, let's have a look around." As they entered the garden, the chateau loomed even larger, its silent facade a canvas for the setting sun's rays. Elizabeth's heart raced with a mix of awe and anticipation. Each step took her deeper into the heart of the estate, the whispers of the past growing louder in her imagination. She could almost hear the laughter of bygone days, the rustle of silk gowns, and the clinking of glasses from celebrations long since faded into memory. Aunt Marguerite led her to a vantage point where the full grandeur of the chateau was visible. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of connection to this place, as if the chateau and its grounds were reaching out to her, inviting her to uncover their secrets and become a part of their continuing story. That evening, as Elizabeth settled into the comforting routine of dinner with Aunt Marguerite, her thoughts lingered on the chateau. She knew she would return soon, drawn by the allure of its history and beauty, and as she retired for the night, the image of the chateau under the stars filled her dreams. Chapter 3. Elizabeth stepped into the chateau's garden, a wild and overgrown sanctuary of tangled vines and vibrant blooms. As she ventured deeper, she noticed a solitary figure working quietly among the roses. It was Henri, the caretaker she had heard of, known for his dedication to the estate and its grounds. His presence was almost as much a part of the garden as the ancient trees and weathered statues. "Good morning," Elizabeth called out tentatively, not wanting to startle him. Henri straightened up from his task, his eyes briefly assessing her, before he nodded in acknowledgement. "Mademoiselle," he greeted, his voice reserved but not unkind. "I'm Elizabeth," she introduced herself, stepping closer. "I've just recently arrived to stay with my aunt, Marguerite. I've heard so much about the chateau and its gardens. They're beautiful, even in their wildness." "Yes, they have their own charm," Henri replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "They're a piece of history, living and breathing just like us." Elizabeth watched as he returned to his work, his movements deliberate and skilled. "May I help?" she asked, eager to learn and be a part of the garden's life. Henri paused, considering her for a moment. "Do you know much about gardening?" he asked, a hint of curiosity in his otherwise stoic demeanor. "Not as much as I'd like," Elizabeth admitted with a smile, "but I'm willing to learn and get my hands dirty." He nodded, then pointed to a small trowel and pair of gloves lying on a nearby bench. "Then you can start by helping me clear out the weeds around those roses. They need room to breathe." "Yes, I know the feeling," Elizabeth smiled. As they worked side by side, Elizabeth tried to engage Henri in conversation, curious about the man whose life was so entwined with the chateau's history. "How long have you been caring for these gardens?" she asked, pulling at a stubborn weed. "Many years," Henri responded succinctly, focusing on a particularly overgrown bush. "It's been my charge to keep the legacy alive, to ensure the history doesn't fade into oblivion." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the weight of such a responsibility. "It must be quite the task maintaining all of this, but it's important, isn't it? Preserving the past." "It is," Henri agreed, a flicker of passion breaking through his reserved exterior. "These gardens, this chateau, they tell a story, and we must listen." The morning passed, the garden slowly revealing its beauty as they cleared and tended to the plants. Henri's reserved nature didn't waver much, but Elizabeth sensed a depth to him, a shared reverence for the estate and its stories. As they finished their work, Henri showed her how to properly prune the roses, his hands steady and sure. "Like this?" he instructed, demonstrating before handing her the shears. Carefully, Elizabeth followed his guidance, cutting away the dead wood to reveal the healthy bloom beneath. "Like this?" she asked, looking up for his approval. "Yes, just like that," Henri confirmed with a slight nod, the briefest smile touching his lips. As they packed away their tools, Elizabeth felt a sense of accomplishment and connection, not just to the garden but to Henri as well. And as they parted ways, Elizabeth knew that her time in the garden would be a cherished part of her days at the estate, a quiet communion with the past and the present, guided by the reserved but knowledgeable Henri. Elizabeth returned as often as she was able. The days following her initial tour of the garden were spent wandering the halls and rooms of the once illustrious estate, each step a journey through time. The chateau's interior was a maze of history, the air heavy with the dust of ages. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the floor and illuminating the faded grandeur of the once vibrant tapestries. The walls, lined with portraits of stern ancestors and delicate beauties, seemed to watch her with silent appraisal, their eyes following her as she moved. As she explored, Elizabeth felt the weight of countless stories pressing in around her. The chateau was alive with the echoes of laughter and sorrow, of whispered secrets and declared loves. In the grand ballroom, she could almost hear the music and mirth of bygone celebrations, the clinking of glasses and the rustle of silk gowns. The library, with its shelves heavy with leather-bound tomes, spoke of quiet afternoons and the pursuit of knowledge, stained with the scent of old paper and wood polish. Each room held a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the life that had thrived within these walls. Elizabeth moved through them with a reverence, touching the carved woodwork, the stone mantels, feeling the pulse of the past under her fingertips. It was as if the chateau was slowly revealing its soul to her, trusting her with its memories and dreams. Henri, ever present yet unobtrusive, became her guide to the chateau's history. He shared stories of the estate's heyday, of the lineage of nobles who had made their mark on both the land and the local lore. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the high windows, Elizabeth found herself in what was once the lady's private chamber. The room was smaller than the others, more intimate, with a faded mural of the countryside adorning one wall. It was here, Henri explained, that the last lady of the chateau had spent her final days, a recluse from the world she could no longer bear, a world that, in time, felt more of a burden than a blessing. "I can't help but wonder," Elizabeth started, "would my story have been the same if I never had the courage to leave my estate in London? I fear that it might have been." Henri grabbed Elizabeth's hand for a moment. "Your courage was a blessing to us all." Chapter 4. The sun rose over the French countryside, its light spilling into the village streets and touching each stone and leaf with warmth. Elizabeth awoke to this light, feeling more at home with each passing day. Her mornings were now a cherished routine, beginning with a walk through the village, greeting the familiar faces with a smile and a tentative bonjour that was always warmly received. The village was a palette of vibrant activity, and Elizabeth found herself drawn into its rhythm. She helped the baker arrange loaves of fresh bread in the window, laughed with children chasing each other in the square, and sat with the elderly who shared stories of the village's past. She was no longer a foreign entity, observing from a distance, but an active participant in the daily dance of village life. Her afternoons were often spent in the company of Aunt Marguerite, visiting the market or attending local events. Each festival and gathering was an explosion of color and sound, a celebration of life that was infectious in its joy. Elizabeth found herself swept up in dances, her feet stumbling over unfamiliar steps, laughter spilling freely from her lips. The music, the food, the communal spirit of these occasions spoke to a part of her soul that had longed for such connection, such unbridled expression of community and joy. As the days passed, Elizabeth felt the rigid, formal edges of her English upbringing softening, blending with the rustic charm and warmth of her new surroundings. She learned to appreciate the quiet beauty of a well-tended garden, the rich taste of locally produced wine, and the simple pleasure of a shared meal or story. Her life in England, with its strict social rules and expectations, seemed a world away. Here, in the rolling hills and lively streets of the village, she was discovering a new way of living, one that was more authentic, more attuned to the natural rhythms of life. As the days lengthened into warm afternoons, Elizabeth and Henri found themselves deep in the throes of restoring the chateau's gardens. With each shared task, their camaraderie flourished, evolving from mere acquaintances to confidants who delighted in each other's company. "Watch your step there. The ivy likes to claim more than its share of the path," Henri warned gently as they maneuvered through a particularly overgrown section of the garden. His voice, always so measured, carried a note of concern. Elizabeth chuckled, stepping back from the encroaching greenery. "I'm beginning to think the plants here might have their own ideas about where the path should lead," she replied, her eyes twinkling with mirth. Henri smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed his usually reserved face. "Perhaps they do. They've had many years to ponder their plans, after all." Their conversations, initially halting and reserved, had grown into a comfortable exchange, punctuated by laughter and reflective pauses. They spoke of the plants they tended, the roses that needed careful pruning, the lavender that perfumed the air, and the myriad of other green inhabitants of the chateau's grounds. "Do you see this rose here?" Henri pointed to a particularly robust bloom, its petals a deep crimson. This was the Countess's favorite. She had them planted all around her favorite sitting spot to enjoy their fragrance. Elizabeth leaned in, inhaling the sweet scent. "It's lovely," she said. "There's something timeless about roses, isn't there? As if they hold all the secrets of the past within their petals." "Yes, they are the keepers of secrets and stories," Henri agreed, his gaze lingering on the flowers. "Just like the chateau." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the gardens, they took a moment to rest, sitting on a weathered bench that offered a view of their day's work. The air was filled with the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming flowers, a testament to their efforts. "Thank you, Henri," Elizabeth said, her voice sincere, "for sharing this place with me, for teaching me about its history and its beauty." Henri looked at her, his eyes softening. "I should be thanking you, Elizabeth. Your presence has breathed new life into this place. It's been a long time since these gardens have heard laughter and seen such care." Their conversation drifted as they sat, speaking of the village, of the changing seasons, and occasionally of themselves, their hopes and dreams, the paths that had led them to this moment. Henri's guitar came out as twilight approached, the soft strumming of chords blending perfectly with the chorus of the evening. As the days in the French countryside turned into weeks, Elizabeth found quiet moments in the evenings to reflect. Often, she would sit by the open window of her room at Aunt Marguerite's cottage, a cup of tea in hand, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, lost in thought. The stillness of the night was a stark contrast to the vibrant life of the days, providing a canvas for her thoughts and emotions. One such evening, Aunt Marguerite joined her, bringing 2 cups of tea and a gentle smile. "You seem far away tonight, Elizabeth," she observed, settling beside her niece. Elizabeth turned, her eyes reflecting the turmoil within. "I was just thinking about everything, the village, the chateau, Henri, and how different life here is from what I've known." Aunt Marguerite nodded, understanding. "It's a lot to take in, my dear, but I see the change in you. You're like a flower that's found the sun after a long time in the shade." Elizabeth smiled at the analogy. "It does feel like that. I came here to escape the life I was living, but I've found so much more. I feel like I'm finally understanding who I am and what I want." They sipped their tea in companionable silence until Elizabeth continued. "It's strange. Back in England, everything was laid out for me, my role, my duties, my entire future. Here, I've had to make choices, to decide what each day will look like, and it's been both terrifying and exhilarating." Aunt Margaret placed a comforting hand over Elizabeth's. "That's the beauty of life, isn't it? Finding the courage to make it your own. I believe that's what you're doing, Elizabeth. And remember, no matter what you choose, it's the journey that shapes us." Chapter 5. The golden hues of summer had settled comfortably over the French countryside, casting a long shadow from a man coming up the old dirt road to the cottage. With quick introduction, he told Elizabeth he was a messenger and came with an urgent letter from England. The envelope, marked with her family's crest, felt heavy in her hands. As she unfolded the letter, her heart sank. Her father's health had deteriorated, and her presence was urgently needed back home. As the reality of her situation sank in, Elizabeth confided in Aunt Marguerite, who offered a sympathetic ear and wise counsel. "Elizabeth, you must go to him. It's your duty as his daughter," she said, her voice a gentle anchor in the storm of Elizabeth's emotions. "Regardless of how you feel about the rules and regulations placed upon you, he has always been kind to you. We will be here, waiting for your return." With a heavy heart, Elizabeth sought out Henri to share the news of her sudden departure. They met in the garden, their private haven within the chateau's grounds. The flowers around them bloomed oblivious to the sorrowful exchange taking place. "Henri, I have to leave," Elizabeth began, her voice quivering slightly. "My father is ill, and I'm needed back in England." Henri's face, usually so composed, softened with concern. "The chateau and the gardens will be here when you return," he promised, his voice firm. "Go and do what needs to be done." The words hung between them in a comfortable silence. Henri stepped closer, his hands gently grasping hers. "Elizabeth, you've brought life back into these old stones," he said, his voice earnest. "You've awakened something in me that I thought was long gone. I will wait for your return, and while you're gone, I will keep the gardens thriving, just as you left them." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as she looked at Henri, the man who had become an unexpected yet vital part of her life. "I will return, Henri," she promised, her resolve firm despite the ache in her heart. "This isn't goodbye. It's just until next time." They shared a heartfelt goodbye, their embrace a silent exchange of hope and sorrow. As Elizabeth walked away, her steps heavy with the weight of her impending journey, she turned back to see Henri standing in the garden, a solitary figure among the blooms. The image of him, surrounded by the beauty they had nurtured together, was etched into her heart, a beacon of light in the difficult days ahead. The journey back to England was a blur of landscapes and emotions, the rolling French hills giving way to the English countryside she knew so well. As the train pulled away, taking her further from the life she had come to love, Elizabeth's thoughts were filled with the chateau, the village, and Henri. She clung to the promise of return, to the hope that this separation was but a brief interlude in the story that was unfolding. And as the French countryside faded into the distance, Elizabeth's heart remained, divided yet determined, caught between duty and desire. Chapter 6. The sprawling estate of her childhood loomed before Elizabeth as the carriage rolled through the gates. The English countryside, with its manicured beauty and ordered calm, felt foreign after the vibrant life of the French village. The grandeur of the family home, once a symbol of pride and comfort, now seemed more like a mausoleum of past expectations and lost dreams. Stepping into the manor, Elizabeth was immediately engulfed in the flurry of activity. Servants scurried through the halls, their faces etched with concern, signaling to the gravity of her father's illness. Family members, some she had not seen since her departure, greeted her with a mix of relief and thinly veiled disapproval. Her brother, a pillar of stoicism, offered a brief embrace, his words heavy with unspoken emotion. "Thank you for coming, Elizabeth. We need you here." As she navigated the echoing corridors to her father's bedside, Elizabeth felt the weight of her family's legacy pressing down on her. The portraits of her ancestors watched silently from the walls, their eyes following her with a mix of judgment and expectation. Entering her father's chamber, the sight of the once formidable man, now frail and bedridden, struck a chord deep within her. His eyes, clouded with pain and weariness, lit up with a flicker of recognition and something akin to gratitude. "Elizabeth, my dear," he whispered, his voice a fragile thread. "You've come back." Sitting by his bedside, holding his withered hand in hers, Elizabeth felt a surge of compassion and duty. The arguments and differences of the past seemed trivial in the face of his vulnerability. She spoke softly, offering words of comfort and strength, all the while feeling the tug of her other life, the one she had been building away from these gilded cages. The days that followed were a blur of consultations with doctors, managing the household, and supporting her family through the crisis. Elizabeth found herself slipping back into the role of the dutiful daughter, her every move watched and critiqued by those around her. Yet, in the quiet moments of the night, her thoughts would drift to the chateau's whispering gardens, to the village's warm embrace, and to Henri's understanding gaze. The life she had tasted, the freedom and authenticity she had found, was sorely missed in the quiet night. One evening, as she sat alone in the vast library, the scent of old books surrounding her, Elizabeth allowed herself to fully feel the ache in her heart. A letter from Henri, tucked safely in her drawer, reminded her of the world she missed dearly. His words, filled with understanding and patience, were a balm to her weary spirit. He spoke of the gardens, of the small changes and growths, each detail a vivid image that brought her back to the life they had shared. "I am here, as are the gardens and the chateau, all awaiting your return," he had written. "Take care of what needs to be done, Elizabeth, but remember that your heart has a home here, amongst the roses and the stone." The letter, stained by drops of tears, was read and reread countless times. Chapter 7. The dimly lit corridors of the estate echoed with the soft, urgent footsteps of servants as Elizabeth made her way to her father's room. The grandeur of the manor felt hollow, each ornate decoration and portrait added to the family's stoic facade. Her father's condition had worsened, his once robust figure now confined to bed, his strength waning with each passing day. Upon entering, Elizabeth was greeted by her brother's grave expression. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and strained, "he's taken a turn for the worse. The doctors are doing all they can, but—" His words trailed off, the reality too heavy to voice. Elizabeth approached her father's bedside, her heart sinking at the sight of him. His breathing was labored, his face etched with the lines of pain and fatigue. "Father," Elizabeth whispered, taking his hand gently in hers. His eyes fluttered open, a glimmer of recognition passing through them. "Elizabeth? My dear," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "You've come back." "Yes, father," Elizabeth smiled. "I've been back." "You have?" Her father looked to her confused. "Oh yes, of course." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, squeezing his hand. As she turned to her brother, the weight of the situation settled between them. "We need to discuss the arrangements," he said, his face tense. "With father like this, the estate, the title, everything is at risk. Why he made her the primary beneficiary, I will never understand. Perhaps you should convince him otherwise." Elizabeth's father had left everything in the family's name to his new wife, a mother to no one in the family. It was a decision that was only discovered when he became ill, and it shook the entire family. With the revelation came the politics, scheming, and dubious planning. "I know," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But the stress of pressing and prodding father can't be good for his health." Her brother looked at her, a flicker of shared concern in his eyes. "Of course," he agreed reluctantly. "But you understand the position we're in, Elizabeth. The future of our family, our very name, is at stake." Elizabeth nodded, the burden of her lineage and duty a constant weight upon her shoulders. As she sat by her father's side, watching over him as the night deepened, the conflict within her grew. The estate, with its long-standing traditions and the looming crisis, demanded her presence, her leadership. Yet, the desire for the life she had begun to build in France, for its freedom and authenticity, pulled at her heart. The estate's walls seemed to close in around her, the whispers of desperation growing louder with each passing hour. As she watched her father's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, Elizabeth knew that the days ahead would test the very limits of her strength and resolve. As Elizabeth navigated the complex web of familial expectations and the deteriorating health of her father, the manor's atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating. The stately dining room where the family gathered for meals became a battleground of veiled words and palpable tension. Each relative seemed to have their own agenda, their own vision for the future of the estate, and Elizabeth found herself at the center of it all. One evening, the weight of her family's expectations came to a head. Over dinner, her uncle, a stern figure with a hawkish gaze, addressed her directly. "Elizabeth, you must understand the gravity of our situation," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "With your father's condition as it is, the stability of our estate, our family's reputation, it all hangs in the balance." Elizabeth met his gaze, her own eyes weary yet resolute. "I understand, Uncle." Her cousin, always quick to voice her opinions, chimed in. "Of course we care for Uncle, but Elizabeth, you must go in there and press him. Now. Put some pressure on him. He always respected your opinion. You are needed to guide the estate, to make the decisions that will secure our future." The conversation went round and round, each family member adding their voice to the chorus of expectations. Elizabeth felt the walls closing in, the air heavy with the burden of her bloodline. After dinner, Elizabeth sought refuge in the manor's expansive gardens, the cool night air, a small relief from the stifling environment inside. She walked the gravel paths, her footsteps echoing softly, until she found herself at the edge of the reflecting pool. The moon's reflection shimmered on the water's surface, a solitary witness to her turmoil. "Elizabeth?" Her brother's voice broke the silence, his figure appearing from the shadow of the hedgerows. "May I join you?" She nodded, and he came to stand beside her, looking out over the pool. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice softer now. "We all feel the weight of what's happening, but we look to you for guidance, for strength." Elizabeth sighed, a mixture of frustration and fatigue lining her words. "I don't have all the answers, James. I'm doing the best I can, but my heart, it's not just here anymore. There's a part of me that belongs to another life, one that I started to build in France." James looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I know you miss your new life there, but Elizabeth, this is your duty. Our family, our legacy depends on you." The word duty hung heavy in the air, a chain that bound her to the manor, to the relentless cycle of expectations and responsibilities. As she stood there, gazing into the pool's reflective surface, Elizabeth reflected on the road ahead. Elizabeth thought of leaving it all now, before anything had resolved. The burdens of blood and the toxic dynamics of her family were a heavy yoke, but the promise of her life in France, the memories of freedom and authenticity, burned bright in her heart. The decision she faced was not just about where she would go, but who she would become. And as she climbed the stairs to her room, each step felt like a journey towards an inevitable crossroads. The days following were laden with a thick, suffocating anticipation, the entire estate holding its breath as Elizabeth's father's condition worsened. His moments of lucidity were few, and in those precious intervals he would squeeze Elizabeth's hand, his eyes conveying a lifetime of love and regret. And then, one quiet, somber morning, her father passed away, leaving a silence in his wake that echoed through the halls of the grand manor. The aftermath was a blur of arrangements and condolences, the estate a hive of whispered conversations and somber faces. Elizabeth moved through it all like a specter, her actions automatic and her heart numb. She listened to the empty platitudes and accepted the stiff hugs, all the while feeling a growing urge to flee, to break free from the oppressive atmosphere and the burdens that had been laid at her feet. Her family's true colors emerged more vividly in the wake of her father's death. The funeral was barely over before conversations turned to inheritance, to the future of the estate, and to Elizabeth's role in all of it. There was much conversation in overturning the will and planning how to regain every last drop of money given away. The toxic environment, the relentless pressure, and the grief that she hadn't fully processed became an unbearable cacophony that drowned out her thoughts. One evening, as the sky painted itself in hues of mourning, Elizabeth made her decision. She couldn't stay. Not now. Not in this place that had become a prison of expectations and sorrow. She penned a letter to her brother, her words a mixture of farewell and explanation, of love and desperate need for distance. "James," she began, "I cannot stay here. The weight of our family's legacy, the scheming that pervades this place, it's too much. I need to find my own way, to heal, and to live a life that's true to who I am. I'm going back to France, to the life I started there. Please understand, this isn't an easy decision, but it's one I must make for my own well-being." She left the letter on her brother's desk, her bags packed with only the essentials. Slipping out of the manor under the cover of night, Elizabeth felt a weight lift off her shoulders with each step she took. The cool air of freedom kissed her face. Chapter 8. Elizabeth stepped off the train into the embrace of the French countryside, its familiar sights and smells enveloping her like a warm, comforting blanket. The grief and turmoil from England still clung to her, but with every breath of the fragrant air, she felt it loosening its grip. The village lay ahead, its cobblestone streets and cheerful homes a stark contrast to the cold manor she had left behind. As she made her way through, the villagers greeted her with smiles and words of welcome, their kindness a soothing balm to her weary soul. Mademoiselle Elizabeth, they called, their faces brightening at her return. Welcome back, she thanked them, her heart lifting with each step towards the chateau. The thought of seeing Henri again, of sharing the gardens and quiet moments, quickened her pace. She had left so much behind in England, but here, in this place of beauty and peace, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. As Elizabeth approached the chateau, its familiar silhouette a beacon in the distance, her anticipation grew. The gardens, where she had spent countless hours by Henri's side, were just as she remembered, wild, beautiful, and waiting. She quickened her steps, her eyes scanning the grounds for any sign of him, and then there he was, standing amidst the roses they had tended together, his figure a strong, comforting presence. Henri looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment all the weight of her grief and turmoil seemed to fall away. "Henri," she called out, her voice carrying across the garden. At the sound of her voice, his face broke into a wide, genuine smile, the kind that had been so rare but meant everything. He strode towards her, his steps quick and sure. "Elizabeth," he said as they met, his hands reaching out to take hers. "You've returned?" "Yes, I've returned," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't stay away, not from this place, not from you." They stood there, hands clasped, the garden blooming around them as if in celebration of their reunion. Henri's gaze was intense, filled with an emotion that mirrored her own. "I've missed you," he admitted, his voice low. "The chateau wasn't the same without you." "And I've missed you," Elizabeth said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You in this place, it's where my heart is, where I belong." They stood there for a long moment, the world around them fading into a blur. The chateau, the village, and the rolling countryside were all witnesses to their reunion, to the promise of a new beginning. Elizabeth knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, that the shadows of her past would occasionally cloud her days. But with Henri by her side, and the beauty of the chateau as their backdrop, she felt a strength and resolve she had never known before. As they walked back towards the chateau, their steps in sync, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace. She was home, not just in place, but in heart and spirit. The journey back had been long and fraught with pain, but now, as she looked ahead to the future, she saw only possibility and hope. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a soft golden light, Elizabeth knew that no matter what lay ahead, she was exactly where she was meant to be.